All right, the session is being recorded. Looks like we've got people joining in, which is excellent. Give people a couple seconds to hop in, and we'll get it going.
All righty.
Cool. If everybody can hear me, can someone type something in the chat window? Got it. Cool. Awesome. All right. Welcome, everybody. My name is Alex Hart. I'm the Raleigh ISSA Treasurer. We're very happy you're joining us for InfoSeCon virtually this year. I won't rag on 2020 too much since I know that's everyone's going to do at the very beginning. But I do want to just take a moment and be thankful for all you guys showing up, our great speakers. Derek, thank you for being here. And I'm going to go ahead and hand it off to Derek after I read his bio, which is right here. So Derek has been a security professional for the past 12 years and has served in capabilities across the security industry in healthcare, communications, and professional services. Responsibilities include managing a security operations center, leading SOX, HIPAA, PCI, compliancy efforts to success. Currently, Derek focuses on full scope security assessments to help organizations understand the impact that a realized threat actor could have. Full scope security assessments include assessing organizations over the internet from inside their network, their wireless infrastructure, social engineering, physical security, web application assessments, and mobile application assessments. And Derek, it's all yours.
All righty. Thank you very much for that introduction. So yeah, this session, as I'm sure you know about, is called Better Together, and it's all about how purple teaming sharpens your security defenses. So you see some more of my qualifications there in the lower left-hand corner. And just to reiterate, for work, I do a lot of penetration assessments for clients, pretty much solely what I do these days. So that's the perspective that I'm going to bring to what purple teaming actually is. So thanks so much for joining me this evening to hopefully learn some things. So we'll get right into it. Here's the agenda. We're going to talk through what is a purple team exercise if you don't happen to know what that is. And we'll be saying purple teaming a lot, and really just know that it's security assumptions testing. So if you have any sort of assumption about security, whether it's that your antivirus works or that your log sim is working or anything like that, purple teaming and security assumptions testing go hand in hand. They're synonymous to me. So that's kind of a brief definition before we actually get into it. And then we're going to be going to talk to how we got to purple teaming, and then how a purple team exercise works. So the idea here is that by the end of this presentation, you'll have a good idea of how to perhaps carry one of these out against your own organization, or perhaps even your own home network. If you have some security technologies configured on your home network, it's always a good idea to test them and make sure that they're working appropriately. Then we'll be going into how to get more out of purple team exercises. And then what I'll do is I'll show you the roadmap that we use here at LBMC to do purple teaming for clients. So once again, you'll be able to kind of go out and do this work on your own or for your organization or perhaps in your department even. And then we'll leave some time for questions. So let's get straight to it. What is a purple team exercise? So during a security assessment and a penetration assessment in particular, there are two traditionally separate teams that are realized during a pen test, and they're usually called the blue team and the red team. So the blue team is typically going to be or the part of the organization at the clients that I do security assessment testing against, which manages, monitors, and protects the systems being attacked. So think, firewalls, the antivirus, the log sim, maybe some network access control. And then the red team, which is responsible for attacking the systems with the intent to gain some level of unauthorized access. And that's usually the team that I play for. And usually these sort of security assessments, there may be some level of interaction between the blue and the red team in the sense that, we have the kickoff call once we have the statement of work with the client, and we'll usually talk to them. And for a normal pen test, we may talk to the client, give them daily or weekly updates as we're kind of going through the process. But there's not that sort of linked communication that purple teaming implies. So of course, the name purple team is derived from the combination of the two colors, and it's the two teams working together instead of more mutually exclusive than not. So how did we get here? Which is quite an interesting question to me. And I'm curious why we didn't actually start from purple teaming. I kind of get some of the stereotypes around hackers, perhaps not being socially aloof and things like that. So it kind of makes sense that it started from the majority of pen tests, that's just some hacker sitting wherever they're at in their office doing their job. They write the report, and there's usually minimal interaction points or touch points between the pen tester and the client for a traditional pen test. So to define what that is, a pen test is performed by a threat actor who attempts to gain some level of unauthorized access to an organization using various tactics, techniques, and procedures. So during the initial steps of engagement, like I was just mentioning, we'll usually talk with clients about what sort of update cycle they want. And most clients prefer weekly updates. So when we start testing, when we stop testing, and if we happen to find anything critical in between that we felt should merit their immediate attention, perhaps some level of unauthorized access to data or remote code execution for some sort of system on the internet that they have, right? We want to let our clients know about that immediately so they can get that fixed sooner rather than later. Nonetheless, some clients also do prefer daily updates, what tactics, techniques, and procedures we covered on that day. Some clients even want the specific times that they were carried out so they can go back to their security technologies, and maybe we were attacking a web server and the client can go and look, we didn't see any of those web server attacks, which, believe it or not, within the OWASP top 10, that is number 10, a lack of logging and monitoring for web applications. And I think within the OWASP top 10, it quotes about 200 days before an organization realizes that their web application is compromised. And it's really just due to a lack of logging and monitoring on those web applications, as an example here. So while a good pen test will include various indicators of compromise, not all of them do unless the assessment team goes the extra mile. So all of those indicators of compromise that I was just referencing, if we happen to be attacking a web server, some clients want to know about that, some clients don't. And in my opinion, a good pen test team will kind of go that extra mile and make sure that they collect all their indicators of compromise as they're interacting with a client's system in various manners, just to be sure that the client knows exactly what we did against their systems. But again, the sharing of indicators of compromise is not a traditional thing for most penetration test work. So let's dive into the indicators of compromise a little more. The IOCs can fall into 5 categories when it comes to analysis. So let's say, let's go back to that web app, the web app example. We're just a threat actor sitting out on the internet trying to gain access to some sort of web server. And we found what we think is vulnerable, and we're trying to attack it right now. So this hacking activity is going to fall into these 5 categories that we see with relation to the organization's logging program. So maybe we're attacking the web server, and worst case scenario, nothing's logged, nothing at all. Perhaps some information is logged, but it's not forwarded to a central log server. Perhaps it's logged and forwarded, but not alerted on. There's been quite a few breaches over the years that fall into that category where they're doing the logging, they're doing the forwarding, but there's not that sort of security process to make sure that the incidents are responded to appropriately or that they're alerted on. And then as for the appropriate response side of things, the hacking activity could be logged, forwarded, and alerted on, but no response was taken. And finally, we have fairly secure and mature organizations that will log, they will alert, and they will respond effectively to whatever they're seeing within their log sim. So a pen test that chooses to report on all of these IOCs still doesn't have visibility into all of these things here unless the client brings it to the attention of the tester. So, when we're going through a typical pen test, some clients will send us this information and some of them won't. We will of course ask and say, hey, these are the things we did. What did you get alerted on? What did you see us do? And some clients share that information and some of us don't, or some of them don't rather. And this really gets into how we got to purple teaming. It's that kind of formal sharing of the pen tester saying, hey, this is what we did, and we're aware of our tradecraft enough to know exactly what we're doing to a system as we're attacking it. So here's all these IOCs. So even for small environments, months of work could be derived from hardening an environment given a pen test's results that include IOCs. So it could be, problems with the web server. Maybe we got in with some weak passwords over their VPN and their Citrix portals, which I would say happens to about a third of our clients. We're just simply guessing a weak password does the trick, right? Which still kind of befuddles me to this day, but it's part of the security process that is left into the hands of the users. And if there's not a strong password policy and good education around what makes a good password, it just kind of makes sense that to steal the line from Office Space, that the minimum is done as it relates to password complexity. So we see a lot of, dictionary words, capitalize the first letter followed by some numbers, the seasons followed by the year, and things along those lines. So now that we know how we got to purple teaming, and again, it was that disparity between, we have a typical pen test that may or may not care about the IOCs. Better pen test companies will, and they'll share that with their clients. And then we have the purple teaming side of things where, well, it really wasn't known as purple teaming yet, but just clients that want to really test all of these security assumptions and kind of do more with those indicators of compromise. So we've got a good understanding of what a purple team is and how we got here. Let's take a look at how these things work. So first off, some initial discussions need to occur to determine what threat groups or list of tactics, techniques, and procedures that we're going to carry out for a client. Maybe they're somewhat interested in a ransomware event, let's say. That seems to be quite the hot topic given some of the recent guidance by the FBI. For that one in particular, maybe we would then test, look at various ransomware compromises that have happened, and then mimic those for clients. So maybe it starts with a phish. We get a valid account, and then we log in over VPN, and then we happen to have access to various things that we can just start encrypting. So whatever the initial list of tactics, techniques, and procedures may be, it's important to know that the organization has to have some idea of what they actually want to test. So next up, the stakeholders from both sides discuss security controls and expectations for each TTP. So let's say, let's use that scenario where there's a compromise, maybe a phished credential that allows a threat actor to log in remotely to a network. So the first control that I think of there would be multi-factor authentication, right? Can we just take that username and password and log in? So let's say the organization has an assumption that their multi-factor authentication will stop threat actors from getting in. And this is quite a common assumption that clients of ours have. So stakeholders from both sides decide how to test this. And what would usually happen is when we're going through these testing procedures, perhaps we find a gateway into their internal network that does not have multi-factor authentication. And we'll get into that a little bit more here shortly on some various multi-factor authentication bypasses that we typically run into for this type of work. So once we've figured out the tactics, techniques, and procedures, and we've agreed on the assumptions to be tested, so the assumption here would be multi-factor authentication would stop a stolen credential from having a severe organizational impact as it relates to ransomware. That's the assumption, or the hypothesis, if you will. So next up, while screen sharing and using communication platforms with the blue team, the red team carries out the agreed upon tactics, techniques, and procedures while keeping the blue team abreast of what's occurring in real time. And again, to contrast this with a typical pen test, I would be sitting in my office for perhaps 1 week, if that's how long the engagement lasted. And then I would just be going through and trying to gain unauthorized access, and I would not be keeping the client in the loop. They may reach out and say, hey, is this you? And I could confirm or deny. And we would, of course, send them all the indicators of compromise after the fact, or perhaps during the engagement if they have if the client wants to approach it that way. But the main difference between the pen test side of things and the purple team is this kind of screen sharing and real-time communication that takes place during a purple team exercise. And it's just so important from a knowledge sharing standpoint to make sure that that's what's done during these purple team exercises. So next up, blue teams investigate each TTP for evidence artifacts left by the red team and puts the activity in one of the categories for IOC detection. So let's tie this one out to that multi-factor authentication, that example, just to give everyone a practical idea. For the multi-factor authentication example, let's say, and this is a purple team assessment. So let's just assume that we either stole a credential or we easily guessed it. And for a purple team assessment, a client may even set us up with a credential that has multi-factor authentication configured. Because with this purple teaming thing, we are testing a very specific assumption around whatever the stakeholders decide here for points 1 and 2. So as it relates to multi-factor authentication, a credential that has the right MFA policy on it should have a multi-factor authentication request every single time they log into whatever system is configured for that. However, what we commonly find is that organizations don't have multi-factor authentication deployed successfully, or perhaps they do, but they use a push notification. And what we see with these push notifications is maybe we'll find a user that works at an organization that hasn't been there very long. Let's say 3 to 6 months. So that particular user just may not be aware of, who the training security vendors are, who should be reaching out to who, just kind of the lay of the land as it relates to corporate communication. And they're more likely to take some sort of action that threatens an organization, just because they haven't been trained as much as, say, a user that's been there about 10 years. So, and this has happened multiple times. I would say, I don't know, at least probably on a quarter of the clients that we do this work for. So this is not an uncommon thing. But this user will see these push notifications come across their phone when we log in, and then they may get tired of that push notification calling them, and instead of reporting it to the help desk and having their password changed, they just hit that accept button. So if we tie that scenario out to kind of the idea of purple teaming, what would the blue team be able to look for in that scenario? Well, if they're monitoring their multi-factor authentication solution and they see multiple failures for a user, and let's say this particular multi-factor authentication system, the way that it works, it's going to take a username and a password, and then on success of those first 2 criteria, then it sends out that multi-factor authentication request. Now, if we contrast that type of security architecture with multi-factor authentication that, say, takes the username, the password, and the token all at once, it kind of gets rid of this scenario that we're talking about. But nonetheless, a lot of organizations use push notifications for multi-factor authentication, and we found that users accept those if it calls them a bunch and they're not sure what to do. So from a blue team standpoint, are those multi-factor authentication logs being monitored? Are they even being forwarded to the log sim? And then if all that is true, is there some sort of alert that's configured to make the organization aware that that multi-factor authentication is currently under attack? So they should see a bunch of failures within that multi-factor authentication system. So maybe there's, let's say, 4 failures, and then on the 5th one, the user is just like, why is my phone calling me still about this? I'm just going to hit the accept button. So they hit the accept button, and we're all of a sudden logged in and on the network. So you can kind of see how purple teaming works out, and we find this on purple teams and on pen tests, but we can see how that sort of assumption that, we're an organization, we have multi-factor authentication, we're good. That is really not the case, just as it relates to training around the multi-factor authentication. So the blue team looks for those failures within that multi-factor authentication solution. And then let's say that they did not get alerted on it. So we've pointed out a deficiency as the red team, and we've put that deficiency in one of the indicators of compromise categories for detection. So what takes place next? Well, and this is, again, very important that this takes place during the purple team exercise. It's not a change control request much later that happens within an organization, maybe 1 or 2 weeks out. This happens during the actual purple team assessment. So the blue team further tunes the security systems during the exercise to effectively log forward and then alert and respond to each TTP executed by the red team. So to go back to that multi-factor authentication bypass example, let's say the blue team goes and they do some log forwarding. Let's say that the MFA logs weren't even being forwarded, which is, again, common. And then they forward them to their log sim, and then they get an alert set up that says, after 3 failures within the MFA solution, I want to be sent an alert on that. That seems like a very high priority thing. And that assumes that the security architecture is, let's put in the username and the password, the push notification then takes place on success of those first two criteria. And then that's when the user maybe hits that deny button. So then the failure pops up within the system, right? Okay, so the blue team's fixed all of that. And instead of just assuming that that works now, the red team actually goes back and they carry out those same tactics, techniques, and procedures to further confirm that the changes implemented by the blue team to security systems now accurately detect and report on the TTP executed. So as opposed to the logs not even being forwarded from the MFA system before, now they're being forwarded to the log sim, they're being alerted on, and the security team confirms that they got an alert when we started doing a bunch of failures with the MFA solution. So that's just one example. That's a fairly common example. Various other ways around multi-factor authentication that we commonly see if you're curious on that front. Perhaps they have multi-factor authentication on their VPN, but they do not on their email system, and they deliver their multi-factor authentication token to their email. So we log into their email, then we try to log into VPN, we grab the token, and we log into VPN. The user's accepting the tokens, the MFA not being deployed consistently across all of the services it should be, and a fairly unique one involves software as a service applications that are extremely common at organizations. Can we perhaps use a ticketing platform like ServiceNow or Freshdesk or whatever an organization may use to upload some malicious content, and then that gets downloaded and triaged by somebody in the help desk? Maybe it's a PowerPoint that is some training. They download the PowerPoint and then they execute it on their system, and then we have internal network access. And that one's quite tricky, right? So the idea is that software as a service application should be secured with the same security posture as on-prem technologies. So, if the on-prem security posture is MFA on VPN and MFA on email, maybe you're using things like Smartsheet, ShareFile, all these kind of software as a service applications that businesses seem to be relying on more today. All of those need to be secured with multi-factor authentication if they have the correct sensitivity and could potentially lead to some sort of connection to the internal network. And now, ServiceNow and Freshdesk and things like that don't have internal network connectivity. But if we put a malicious attachment in a service desk ticket like that ends up there, we could very well gain access to an organization. And that's happened quite a few times in this line of work historically. So to get back to purple teaming here, the last step we do is we document thoroughly for reporting, which includes the assumptions for each security control assessed, date and time for each tactic, technique, and procedure assessed, screen captures of the specific workflow the red team used for each TTP, and screen captures of the blue team's logging, detection, alerting, and response capabilities. So all of this stuff is definitely not documented during a pen test. So you can see how there's kind of this main difference that's arising between purple teaming and pen testing, where one, this is very collaborative. Two, changes are being made in real time to improve the security posture of the systems and actually do what's called trust but verify. That's a saying that served me very well in my career. I trust everything that clients tell me, but I also go the extra mile to validate and verify what they are actually telling me. Do those systems have multi-factor authentication, or can I get around it in some manner? So that is how a purple team exercise works. So we know what a purple team exercise is, how we got here, which was, again, mainly just a lack of collaboration between the pen test team and the purple team. And then we know how a purple team exercise works. So how to get more out of these purple team exercises. So is a purple team exercise right for your organization? Well, a quick security program maturity checklist, just really a couple of questions. One, do you know what you have? So a good security program is always going to start with asset management. Do you have an inventory of all the various things within an organization that have an IP address, that are somewhat network connected? And then the next question, have best practices as it relates to security for those technologies been implemented? There's various roadmaps out there. Microsoft has like a 90-day roadmap that if you're using their cloud services or their on-prem services, that you should go through over the course of 90 days to harden that environment. And that process of hardening is going to give you various assumptions about that environment. One of those assumptions may be that workstation logs are forwarded. So one, what do you have? And then two, have the best practices as it relates to security been implemented on the assets that an organization has? So once those two questions are answered, are there current assumptions around security technologies whose functions support critical business operations which are threatened given the current threat landscape? So let's go back to ransomware for this one, right? Where just a very common attack scenario. So perhaps there's been some controls put into place that are supposed to address ransomware scenarios. Well, an organization would likely be prudent to make sure that those preventative ransomware controls work before they're actually needed. So there's various things that an organization can do to test those security controls, whether it's in the context of a purple team or mimicking a ransomware event to see how the security technologies respond and if they respond in the intended way. Okay, so we've got a good idea of what a purple team exercise is, how we got here, the specific steps to carry one out, and whether or not something like this is ripe for your organization. So now we're going to get into some tools to help us go through this process. And I can't speak highly enough about this Mitre attack framework. If you haven't heard of it yet, here is a link. And if you'll give me just a moment, I will pull it up here on my computer. Let me share my browsing window. All right. Can everybody, hopefully everybody can see this here. It looks like I'm sharing it correctly. So here is the Mitre attack framework. We have all of these swim lanes, and these are really just steps that threat actors go through to compromise organizations. Whether they have to go through reconnaissance, they have to develop resources to utilize from a technical standpoint. They have to have some sort of initial access vector. They have to have execution and so forth. So we'll be kind of talking through this Mitre attack framework as the presentation goes on. So let me jump back to my PowerPoint here. All right, I do believe that's sharing again. So again, the Mitre attack framework is a catalog of known threat actors, which verticals they target, and their tactics, techniques, and procedures. This particular resource has detailed information on what tools the threat actors use, including how the tools are chained together to achieve some level of unauthorized access and how to prevent and detect the TTPs. So how is all this related to a purple team exercise? Well, using the Mitre attack framework can help us define what tactics, techniques, and procedures we want to test. So remember, step one of the purple team exercise included an initial discussions to determine what threat groups or TTPs to test. The Mitre attack has all of those. They have both the tactics, techniques, and procedures. They have the detections, the mitigations, and so forth, which I'll walk the audience through here momentarily. So start small by selecting specific TTPs that you have read about in the news or your organization has experienced and select it from the Mitre attack framework. Review the tactic technique examples, detections and mitigations. Determine assumptions around security controls that address the selected TTP and devise a testing plan that puts the assumption to the test. And then we want to test the assumptions and document. So one of the more common areas that organizations are concerned with that we end up testing involve various endpoint protections. So it's common that organizations will spend quite a bit of coin on protecting their endpoints. Got this idea out there of zero trust networking, and pretty much every network that an asset's connected to these days should be considered hostile, which is likely more true this year than it was in years past. So how do our workstation, the workstation endpoints react when being compromised with malware? So let's walk through a Mitre attack example, starting with initial access. Then we'll move to the execution swim lane, and then we will end with persistence, which have historically been the first three phases that a threat actor will go through once they have all their tooling and their approaches together. So let me bring back up the Mitre attack framework here. All right, so we said that we're going to go through initial access and then execution and then persistence. So to go back to that multi-factor authentication example, let's say that we just find a weak password. Let's say we found out what vendors an organization used by perhaps looking at LinkedIn, and we get a list of vendors and users that actually work at an organization. We take that custom user list, once we mangle it, maybe it's first name dot last name, whatever the username syntax is, we mangle it and we get a list of custom users, and then we just start guessing weak credentials. And maybe an organization wants to know if they can detect that particular attack called password spraying, where we're going to try one weak password against all of these user accounts. And we're, of course, not going to lock out any sort of accounts because we're only trying one password against all of the user accounts. And then maybe we wait till after lunch and we try another password. This is a very effective attack in just identifying weak credentials and valid accounts. So let's take a look at this one here. If we pull up this TTP, we see here, one, to point out that what type of valid account is it? Well, we've got default accounts, we've got domain accounts, we've got local accounts, and a more recent one, we've got some cloud accounts. So all of these, of course, should be monitored a little bit differently. So if we take a look at domain accounts, notice that there are different resources for all of the different accounts. If we take a look at cloud accounts, there's going to be a different list of APTs that have used cloud accounts to compromise organizations. So let's talk domain accounts for the moment. We have a high-level overview within the Mitre attack framework that's on just what exactly this means. So if you can't see that on the screen, I'll go ahead and read a short blurb of it, which is adversaries may obtain and abuse credentials of a domain account as a means of gaining initial access, persistence, privilege escalation, or defense evasion. So notice too that it listed quite a few different swim lanes here that we saw on the overall Mitre attack framework. So valid accounts can exist as a means of initial access. It can be a means of persistence, right? Because we just have a valid account, so we can log in whenever we'd like. It could be a means of privilege escalation. Perhaps we, that one account that we have has local administrator access over various other accounts, or various other systems rather, or accounts, I suppose. So we could use that as a privilege escalation manner. Or we could also use it for defense evasion. And it's very likely that we're going to be using these for all of them, just knowing that organizations have a very difficult time of detecting valid accounts being used within their organization to perform various functions if they don't have some sort of behavioral and heuristic monitoring. So as with all the TTPs within the Mitre attack framework, we've got kind of a brief overview at the top. And then we scroll down and we see the procedure examples. So what advanced persistent threats actually use this particular tactic, technique, and procedure? Well, we've got APT 29 here. They use valid accounts, including administrator accounts, to help facilitate lateral movement on compromised networks. We've got APT 3 here that leverages valid accounts after gaining credentials for use within the victim domain. We've got some tooling called Cobalt Strike. That's some proprietary tooling that's very commonly used by red teams or pen test teams or even threat actors, legitimate or not, that can take advantage of valid accounts. So we've got kind of the background on the TTP. We've got the actual threat actors that used it. And then we've got mitigations. So we talked about multi-factor authentication, and we can, of course, click this here. And we can see all the various attacks that multi-factor authentication addresses. We talked about password spraying and how effective that can be. And then, of course, we've got privileged account management and all of the techniques that privileged account management can potentially address if it's configured and managed properly. And this is quite exhaustive, right? So we've got the background, some examples, the mitigations, and think of mitigations as preventative controls, right? But detection is just as important as prevention. And that is, I think, a concept that's going to be more and more accepted by the security community as time goes on, knowing that if a well-resourced attacker has enough resources, as in time, then they will likely be able to get around any preventative controls that an organization has. So at that point, it's just a matter of detection, right? That's kind of the other side of the coin, where if something's not prevented, hopefully we can at least detect it. And to tie this one back out to the web server example, we were talking about the OWASP top 10 and how within the top 10, logging and monitoring is in the OWASP top 10, 200 days of dwell time that's typical before an organization realizes their web application has been compromised. 200 days. Okay, so let's say, let's get back here. So that's the assumption that we have, that we want to test for our purple team exercise. We want to know if valid accounts can be detected for initial access. So let's say we have initial access. Maybe it was detected, maybe it wasn't, whatever it was, we of course thoroughly documented the results of it. Maybe we ran into some multi-factor authentication on some of the endpoints, maybe we didn't. Whatever the results of it though, we document from a purple team exercise standpoint exactly what we can do with these valid accounts here. And can we get on the network really? So next up, just kind of walking through all the things that an attacker could potentially do. Let's say that this client has some level of interest in logging WMI calls once we have that valid account. So let's say we are within a Citrix environment, and we are a user on a Citrix environment, and we're trying to do code execution via WMI. So we pull up this TTP, and we may not know even what WMI stands for. But we know that the Mitre attack has that information for us, right? So it's extremely important to know that, Mitre attack is really a knowledge base of all these tactics, techniques, and procedures. And it really shrinks the gap as it relates to knowledge gaps on, what exactly hackers are doing. Well, if you want to know what hackers are doing, boom, here it is. All these things. These are the known things that hackers are doing to cause some sort of negative impact on organizations. So we come here and we know that our security team has put in some controls to monitor users that should be able to do this, and then prevent users that should not be able to do this. And one of the most effective controls that I've seen just around code execution in general is grouping users into technical and non-technical groups. So non-technical, let's say it's everything outside of IT, as an example. Everybody outside of IT should not be running cmd.exe. So they shouldn't be pulling up a command prompt, as an example. And if a user that is non-technical does pull that up, that should be something an organization should look into. There was a story that a colleague shared at another conference I went to that centered around they spent months gaining access to this organization, and within minutes they had the access removed from that organization's system just because the user that they compromised was non-technical and they happened to run technical commands via command prompt and PowerShell. Something as simple as ipconfig to figure out what your network address is. Should a non-technical user in accounting be running that? No. Do most organizations group users into technical and non-technical users? No, they do not. But that is such an effective control to detect code execution that took that dwell time. We were talking about dwell time as it relates to threat actor dwell time for web applications, around 200 days. Getting that down to as close to right of bang as possible. Bang being the moment the compromise happens. If it can be stopped minutes later because the threat actor happens to run one command on their system, and it's a non-technical user that has never historically ran that sort of stuff, then the account can be disabled and the destruction or the impact of the breach limited if it's detected within minutes as opposed to 200 days. So back to Windows management instrumentation. Let's say that an organization put that control into place. They grouped their users into technical and non-technical users. And the assumption was that they wanted to be sure that they could detect a non-technical user doing command execution via Windows management instrumentation. So that's the assumption from a purple team standpoint. So myself as a purple team practitioner or security assumptions tester, whatever the heck you want to call it. We go out and we're in that Citrix environment. So we just try to do code execution via Windows management instrumentation. And let's say for this example, the organization did a great job. They did the logging, they did the log forwarding, they did the alerting, and they saw it come across. So A+ for them. We document exactly what they did. We document the specific commands we ran. And then perhaps we try to bypass their control a couple of ways. Maybe we use a different binary that's not cmd.exe to do Windows management instrumentation code execution. Maybe we try it with PowerShell, or maybe we try it with raw Windows API calls, things like that. So we test kind of the control in the state that it's in as it's intended, and then we try various bypasses that we're aware of as testers. So if you're curious what threat actors use this Windows management instrumentation for code execution, just like the valid accounts, we've got quite a few things here. And just to briefly dive into these, we've got a mixture of threat groups, the APTs, and then we've also got some examples of tooling. So crackmap exec can execute remote commands using Windows management instrumentation. This, if we're not sure what this is, we click and we see that it's a post-exploitation tool developed in Python for penetration testing against networks. And we see here all of the various things that it can do. And this is a freely and openly available tool out there on GitHub that penetration testers commonly use. So we have all the procedure examples, and then we keep scrolling, and notice that WMI is extremely common, right? So many examples of code execution being used with WMI. We've got some mitigations around privileged account management. So if one were to do this remotely over the network, it does usually require administrator privileges unless it's a severely misconfigured system. And then the other mitigation there just involves user account management. And some other mitigations yet that aren't necessarily represented here would, again, just kind of come with security experience. So what if we just prevent the network communication from taking place altogether with some micro-segmentation? And micro-segmentation, if you're not familiar with that idea, that's the idea that should computers within the same subnet be allowed to communicate with one another? Should a workstation be able to communicate with another workstation? From a business use case standpoint, maybe if it's the help desk trying to get at another computer, sure. However, should computers that are within accounting be able to communicate with one another? Probably not. So micro-segmentation can be put into place. So let's say we gain some level of access to a computer, and we're going to be using WMI to try to laterally move between systems. However, if we don't even have that network communication path in the first place, let's say we're in a 23-bit subnet. We're on a compromised asset. We do a port scan for adjacent systems, and we don't see any ports to communicate with. We don't see TCP 445. We don't see 139. We don't see 135, which are all commonly used ports for remote procedure calls within the Windows world. We don't see any of that stuff. So in addition to these mitigations here, we have things like network segmentation, which can go a very long way in just limiting that overall attack surface that threat actors have to begin with. And then we, of course, have detection, monitor network traffic for WMI connections. But why monitor the traffic when we can just outright block it? And we have these role-based or software-defined networking that's gaining traction, becoming more popular, and get a little giddy when I see clients implement that because there's just so much less attack surface. Just imagine I'm an accountant and I only need access to 3 servers, but I work for a fairly large organization that has 200 servers. So by preventing me from connecting to those other 197 servers, me as a threat actor, I only have some sort of attack surface that is much, much, much less than what I would traditionally have. So we tested this control in the context of purple teaming. We documented everything, and the client did a great job with it. They not only detected us just doing it directly, but they also detected various bypasses that we use just because of how they created their logging and their ruling within their logging system. So persistence, let's do, we'll take a look at scheduled tasks here, just to take a look at another one. And scheduled tasks on what kind of system? Is it on Linux? Is it on Windows? Is it a cron job? Is it on Mac via LaunchD? Is it scheduled tasks? Is it system D timers? All the ways that a task could be scheduled on a system. Let's say, for sake of simplicity, we're going to do the Windows one. So we click on Windows, and then we see here that adversaries may abuse this specific binary to perform task scheduling for initial or recurring execution of malicious code. And given some of the alerts that the FBI and the HHS sent out recently, this one is very valid, where scheduled tasks are being created and essentially waiting for a go command. So we scroll on down a bit. We've got the procedure examples. What tools can use this tactic, technique, and procedure? What APTs have used it in the past? The mitigations in place that an organization could put into place. And the detections. So if we can't prevent the scheduled tasks from being created in the first place, we at least need to be detecting these with various event IDs that are being forwarded to our log sim and being alerted on, and not just being alerted on, but being responded to, right, and triaged appropriately. Okay, so that is an example of using the Mitre attack framework to drive a purple team assessment. Let me click around here to get my PowerPoint back up. All right. Hopefully everybody can see that there. So we just walked through an example where we had an assumption around a TTP with an initial access. We had an assumption around a TTP for execution, and we had an assumption around using scheduled tasks for persistence. And that assumption was that we can detect the execution of the AT.exe for both technical and non-technical users. And then we also touched on how circumvention of control should be tested, as well as the control itself. So measuring progress. We did all that testing from a purple team standpoint. We delivered the report to the client, and the client's looking at it and thinking, okay, I'm feeling pretty good about where I'm at. But as I'm sure we all know, security is kind of a never-ending process, right? So I actually shared my presentation a little too quick here. I'm going to jump back to the Mitre attack framework to quickly share the groups. So if we just go to the main website here, and then we click groups, we see all of the groups. And let's say you're a healthcare organization. So in the lower left-hand corner, that was me just pushing Control F for a find, and then I type in healthcare, and then we see all of the various threat groups that targeted healthcare organizations. So why is this particularly interesting? Well, if we're a healthcare organization, there's a lot of TTPs here within the Mitre attack framework, so we need to be more targeted about it. So we come in here, we search for our vertical like we did. We searched for healthcare. We see that Fin4, which is a threat group, has targeted healthcare, public financial markets, and so forth. So we click on them. And then we have all the TTPs that they used, which is excellent, right? We don't have to go out and do this research ourselves, where the security community has actually done this research for us, right? Where we know the TTPs that threat groups are using to target healthcare institutions. So if we're a healthcare institution, we should probably start with these TTPs, right? We should make sure that the TTPs that these threat groups are using, we have various mitigations and detections in place for these. So we can, of course, click on any of these. We come in, phishing, pretty much every threat group uses that, right? We see the mitigations, we see the detections, and so forth. So that's threat groups within the Mitre attack framework. Pop back up the PowerPoint here. So at the director and manager level, what you can do is look at those threat groups to see which verticals they target, just like I showed you. And then you can click on the group and review the tactics, techniques, and procedures that the individual groups use. And then one can create performance-based metrics that hold the security team accountable for the successful deployment and management of each preventative or detective security control. Next up, the auditors, the engineers, the analysts, if you're in IT, and really anyone else, I'm of the opinion that if you work for an organization, security is part of your job. And just to give an example, let's look at like a database administrator. Maybe they think a little bit about security, but let's say that maybe there's some DBAs out there watching this presentation, and then all those TTPs could be absolutely valid in the context of a database, right? Valid accounts. Can valid accounts be used, or perhaps once those valid accounts are used, should they even have access in the first place? So, if I ever happen to go back to security operations again and a DBA comes to me and they have an interest in securing their databases more than what I've already done, I would definitely listen to them and take whatever they say into consideration and then put appropriate security controls into place. Maybe they managed some databases that just haven't been wrapped into the security program yet. And again, if you don't know what you don't have, then you can't exactly secure it, right? So security is everyone's job within an organization, and it can really just move security culture within an organization forward so much quicker and have that much more of an impact if everybody takes a part in security. So if you happen to be someone at an organization that has an interest in security, this is how to measure progress. You can discuss with leadership the value in preventing the known TTPs that are commonly used against organizations in your vertical. Develop a plan to gradually implement controls to prevent and/or detect the usage of TTPs detailed within the chosen groups, and validate that the controls are configured and monitored appropriately. So to go back to this DBA example, let's say that you go through this process and you find out that maybe domain admins have access to your databases. Should they? Probably not. Knowing that goes against Microsoft best practices as it relates to their tiered architecture for how to use accounts. And they have kind of tier 0, tier 1, and tier 2. Tier 0, you only have accounts for the domain controllers. And then the tier 1, you have accounts specifically for servers. And then tier 2, you have accounts specifically for workstations. And the workstation accounts don't work on the servers or the domain controllers. And the server accounts, of course, do not work on the domain controllers, because if a server gets compromised, then the domain controller gets compromised. And that's a form of privilege escalation, right? Which we don't want. So perhaps you're a DBA out there and you want to take a look at that valid account TTP. And then you do your entitlement review of who has access to your database, and you go to the security team and say, hey, I want these users out of my database. I don't want them in there. There's no business need for them. So let's enforce some least privilege at that level. And as a DBA, you could then put a security practitioner on your resume, right? So you're not only bringing your DBA skill set to an organization that you work at, but you're also bringing this level of security awareness that isn't exactly common across the board yet. So the Mitre attack value. If you're not convinced yet, I'll try to do it here. The TTPs that these threat actors are using have been defined, categorized, and documented in order to shrink the knowledge gap for remediating these issues. So Mitre attack provides the knowledge to prevent or detect these issues, forces the issues of fixing the security concerns to be one of execution and not necessarily knowledge. Whereas historically, it's been this knowledge gap, right? It's like, oh, hackers do this kind of black magic thing, voodoo, whatever you want to call it, and they hack into systems. Well, the Mitre attack framework has exactly what they do laid out: the detections, the mitigations, who uses them, and so on and so forth. It is an excellent resource. So from a best practice standpoint, having a yearly red team exercise is a mature security best practice. And a red team exercise, to contrast that with a pen test, it usually takes place over a couple of months. And the idea is to stay completely undetected, whereas with a pen test, it's actually more valuable to be detected, because then we know where an organization's security posture lies. If we go completely undetected, we don't know at what point we could be detected. And it's better for the organization to know at which point their security systems detect a threat actor than to just go completely undetected. That idea is called threshold testing. So that's a red team and a pen test, and then a purple team exercise. So maybe an organization has a pen test done in February, and then they do their remediation efforts, and then we come back through and we do a purple team exercise 6 months later to test the assumptions that were created during the remediation of the pen test findings. All right, so that's about all that I have for everyone today. Synopsis of key discussion points here. hopefully everyone has an understanding of what a purple team exercise entails and how it evolved, whether or not a purple team exercise is right for your organization, how purple teaming can improve an organization's security posture in a measurable scientific manner, right? We have assumptions, which are essentially hypotheses that are being tested. And then we verify security systems are operating as assumed. And then we can, of course, use that wonderful Mitre attack framework to do to both conduct your own purple team exercises and measure security program effectiveness over time. And consulting firms can charge a lot of money for this type of work. So hopefully this just empowers the listener to go out and kind of do this stuff within your organization and make sure that the security technologies that organizations spend so much money on are kind of out of that first phase of deployment. It's not just working, but it's working, being monitored, being maintained. It's sending the right things to the log sim and all of that. All right. Got one question popping up here with just about 3 minutes left. So if you do have any questions, please send them over now and I'll do my best to answer them with the time left. And if I don't get to it, feel free to reach out to me here. So what is a good starting point, whether role or certification, for someone interested in transitioning from one IT role to being a purple team member? Well, I would go back to that DBA example where, maybe you're not directly responsible for security, but if you just take that responsibility on, there's not really a better way to do it than that, right? You see some area for growth and opportunity. And let's say I'm a security operations manager at an organization. Again, if I had a DBA coming to me, talking to me about security of their databases, I would try to give them good guidance. And I would try to really hire them at some point and bring them onto my security team because they have this functional expertise. Like maybe we don't do transactional logging within our databases, right? And a DBA could very well help us get that together. All right, pulling up the chat here since I missed that. Got 5-10 minute warning. Okay, no questions in chat, and it looks like I answered the only question there. So yeah, if you got any other questions or anything, feel free to shoot them over to my email there. I do believe the presentation was recorded, and I'm not sure if the slide deck will be sent out, but if that's something anybody's interested in, just feel to reach out to me. Thanks again for listening.
Yeah, thanks for coming on. To answer your question, all the sessions over today and tomorrow will be recorded, and they should be being released as we make our final edits and whatnot too, and put some intros and outros and whatnot. But yeah, this was excellent. Feel free to contact Derek at his posted information on the slide. Derek, I don't know if you're going to be hanging out in the chat afterwards, but that might also be a good place to talk to them.
Yeah, sure.
Yeah, thank you. I found this really interesting. This is like directly in my field, so this is cool.
Okay, great. Glad everybody benefited from it, and I'll hop off here so we can get to the next one now. Thanks again, everybody.
All right, see you all soon.